Okay, great. All right. So we'll do this as we've done the other recordings, more or less. The first couple of questions will have to do with how well machine learning and science go together, and also about data science in general, and the significance of data, and yeah, how one must interpret uh, yeah, the role that data plays in science and in general rational inquiry, etc. The next will be more personally tailored to you, and we'll try to exploit your vast background in studying and reading all of the classic texts on the mind, on human thought, and all of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the first question, of course, so machine learning and science, how well do they go together? To what extent should one incorporate the other? And yeah, what do we mean by both of these phrases, perhaps, and how well do they go together? What do you think about that?
Okay. So I would say, look, the simple answer is yes, because see, you got to come down to what machine learning is at the end of the day. It's basically teaching a machine to do what we can do. Fundamentally, that's what it is, right? Teaching a machine to do something. In this case, what we can do. Obviously, we want to transfer whatever responsibilities, you could say, duties, etc., capabilities that we have to the machine, right? Simply. Now, how does a human being learn? Now, a human being learns obviously through behavior, etc. But on a more, you could say, conscious level, there's a science to it, right? So let's say if you're studying mathematics, you develop certain, you understand certain formulas, that you understand certain, what's that called, algorithms, etc., and apply to a large amount of, examples, So you do this. Now, what we're trying to do essentially is we're trying to make the machine do the same thing. But how the human mind does this and how the machine does it, at the moment, it's quite different. The human mind, I see. I always go back and I remember while we were waiting for the what's that called, the ownership, the car deal ownership. You explained to me the difference, what a human being or human mind can do. What I asked you the question as to where machines can't, you can say, eclipse us, or where machines can go that can't go where we can, with respect to cognitive thought. And you said, you told me with respect to deduction, machines can perform the inductive argument very well. In a sense, they can, go from, they can take a large amount of data and abstract it and form some kind of form a rule out of it, and then apply that to, let's say, similar looking data. And so they can do that. Now, so that is something machines can do. They still can't, correct me if I'm wrong again. I don't think they can, perform the deductive, a lot of the deductive argumentation that we can perform. I'd like, if I'm wrong, then you could correct me on that. Yeah, so we're looking at, in this case, we're looking at the inductive argument space, right? So that's where machine learning is, that's where machine learning is, you could say, it functions, or that's the area that it uses. That's the logical, you could say, logical area that it uses. Now, so yeah, that's basic. So you come down to, now how it happens is you give a machine a certain amount of data. Usually it's a sample of data, because you can't really have all the data, because that's you can't use all the data simply for computational and because structural what's that called, bandwidth, right? If you can use all the data, then there's the whole there's a large amount of field of sampling, etc., that's very important in the area of machine learning, completely gets thrown out the window. Because, well, if you can take all the data, it doesn't really, all of that, you don't have to sample, etc. But at the end of the day, you have to sample, because there's too much data essentially. And so you take all this data, you feed it to the machine, and what the machine does is it's able to abstract certain rules from this data, right? And now if you look at that, and if you, like I said, it's a space of the inductive argument, then yes, it is a science. So there's a certain, you have certain input, which is data, and then you form certain rules. It's processed, and certain rules are cleaned from it, and then there's an output. If you look at science, I mean, what is it? It's observation. If it's through observation, or even if it's through deduction, you could say you still start off at some premises, right? Certain you could say assumptions, or certain premises. So these premises are what? These premises can be input, and you pass it through what you call your logical framework, and then you get some output through it. So yes, in short, I would say yes, it is a science. What do you think about that?
Yeah,
do you have
right.
any?
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that induction deduction dichotomy. I don't know if I'd use the same words anymore, though. Yeah, that's very important. Induction and deduction, because from what I'd understood at that point of time, deduction here requires asking certain questions, making certain inquiries, right? And machines right now, we haven't been able to program machines to make the right inquiries, is what I understood. The inquiries that we would make of a system. We proceed. So in fact, in this very real sense, there's no such thing as the scientific method, right? People keep using this phrase scientific method, but there's no method. There's no systematic method, because if there were a systematic method, machines would have caught up with us in this particular regard, right? We'd have been able to simulate the process of thinking up those questions, inventing those questions, and we just haven't been able to do that. There's no systematic method, and that's the reason why machines, as things stand today, we don't have a simulation for human intelligence, because we have to make those queries can't be simulated easily. And induction, I started using that phrase after I began reading Bacon, and Bacon basically, proposes that all science should be a kind of summary of data. He didn't use that phrase, but it's the phrase that's been used several times since then. Summary of data, right? And his idea was your theory should just be a rough and very efficient summary of data as it exists, and it should be flexible. So when you make a new observation, you have to carry on this process of induction. You have to induct that new observation into your theory, and if your theory is flexible enough, you'll just be able to modify it so that it very neatly incorporates the new observation. And that is something, like you said, machine learning is that's what it basically does. You can train a neural network, and the result is a model. The model, so if we're talking, the model basically resembles Bacon's theory in that it can be retrained. You can add more data to your initial training set and retrain your neural network.
Model is, sorry, I was going to say the model is basically the concept that you have inducted out.
Right.
Not inducted out, you could say abstracted out.
Exactly, right. The model is yes, exactly. You've abstracted all the data, and what you have left behind is the model. And it's flexible, right? In the sense that, I mean, above that, there is another, there is different models, for different problems have another thing in common. So there's a higher level of abstraction, which is basically the general prescription of having all of these nodes and layers and propagation and sigmoid functions and all of that. So yeah, that doesn't enter the question right now. The question is, the level of abstraction you were referring to just now, that the model is the data abstracted away. Bacon basically said it should be flexible. It should be flexible, and you should be able to induct new data as and when experiment produces new data. And this is what computers are able to do at the present moment. Even although, in my opinion, even there they have one particular failing, in that their induction of new data produces models that are not really intelligible to us, right? They don't really satisfy our idea of what a theory should look like, because we can't look at the raw file with all the masses for all of your for each node in your neural network and understand what it says. It doesn't really mean so much to us, though we can draw some inferences. That's what the theoretical end of machine learning is focused on. At least partly they focus on that, trying to understand, make some sense of your model. But right. So induction and deduction, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing, and that's a nice way to put it. The other way, of course, in which machines, are yet to catch up with human beings in a very real sense, is um, the fact that there very well may be, phenomena behind, there may be processes underlying thinking that are not simulatable, right? We have very clear cut description of such processes in mathematics and theoretical computer science, because after all, a machine or any physical system, it has certain properties, and from those properties you can actually deduce what it's capable of at a high level of abstraction. More importantly, you can deduce what it's not capable of, right? And it's possible that their underlying thought, just like, is some system, which, just like there might be systems underlying all kinds of phenomena besides human thought, that cannot be simulated by a machine, by a computer, or any similar assembly of parts, any simple physical system. And that's a very real possibility. This sometimes the classification of these two things, for phenomena that can be simulated and those that cannot, the first is, the former is sometimes called problems, which means that eventually it could be amenable to, modeling by using a computer or a similar device. And the other one, the latter, would be called a mystery. And I don't know who originated this this terminology, but I do know that there is a long period of activity following Newton's death, in which David Hume and John Locke wrote a bunch of these things, and basically used these phrases, these two words. And it's not just the scientific philosophers. About a century later, Husserl, again commented on this, and he said, problems, the scientist's habit of seeking out problems, assuming that everything will fall into the realm of problems, is what you'd call a Galilean style of thinking. And it is only the philosopher who understands the possibility that it may very well fall under the category of mysteries. So that's one other way in which machines might, very well never catch up with human thought, but that doesn't necessarily mean that human thought is in any way more capable, on some intrinsic way more capable than a machine. In fact, it actually means that there are physical systems that can comprehend much more than human beings can. But yeah, well, that's just a technical point. You spoke about teaching a machine to do what we do. That is, to do what we do. That is thinking. And maybe the most well-known or most succinct discussion of this is what's called the Turing test. I think this is something you and I should discuss someday. We should read through the book. What is the document called? It was called Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence. I think Turing. We should read through it carefully and discuss different parts of it, especially the beginning. I liked, so in the beginning he talks about, he proposes the question, can machines think? It's as simple as that. And he says, in order to answer this question, we should be able to define what a machine is and what we mean by think. And he said, of course, these are extremely simple words used 100 times a day by the average person, used several times a day by the average person. So everyone knows what they mean, but that doesn't really help us. He says, if we were to take the common, simplest, intuitive meaning for things, then the answer to just about every scientific question can be determined through a Gallup poll. Those were his exact words, and that was a very nice way of putting it. But he said, so we should, try to qualify these a little further, clarify them, and when he tried to do that, as he goes on the article, he comes to a conclusion that we cannot really qualify them in a sufficiently satisfactory sense. The closest thing, best thing we can carry out is this Turing test, which is a basically subjective test. You make human beings interact with a computer and a real person, and if the human being is not able to tell the difference between the two, the human being, exerts his subjective judgment and is unable to tell distinguish between the two, you've found a machine that is simulating human intelligence or human thought. But beyond that, there's no very good objective test for this. And the computer scientist Edgar Dijkstra very neatly summarized it. Yeah, I've been talking too long, and we'll move on to the next question. But Edgar Dijkstra said what Turing showed was effectively asking, can machines think, is very similar to asking, can submarines swim? Right? Because essentially you can actually define swimming to include what submarines do. And similarly, you can define thinking to include what a computer does, basic, simple, symbolic manipulation. So that's what Turing had come to. He couldn't find an a sufficiently objective basis for investigating this question. Yeah. So enough for me. The next question I was going to ask was, about data, which you already touched upon, but I'd like to dive a little bit into this because it seemed to me, and this will, bear upon the next discussion we're going to have, seemed to me that the question of the significance of data actually has a lot to do with, fundamental epistemology, like the rationalist theory of mind, the empiricist theory of mind. Because if you take a look at, an empiricist theory of mind like Hume's, he basically says that the world is a stage, and each new stage in our learning is to be directly associated with something that is performed upon that stage, something that impresses us upon ourselves, impresses itself upon our minds because we were watching the stage. And in more modern times, Russell also upholds this very, very, what is called a stringent empiricist theory of mind, where he says that every thought, human thought, no matter how strange or weird it is, can be mapped to some region of space and time, because all thought is a function of memory. And memory is the space and time are the setting for all events, and so you can map every thought to us. So what do you, so this is why in this context I think you can bring some insight. I want to see what you think, and specifically, if I could ask it more generally, what's the significance that data plays, and how does data science come into that picture? Plays in science. And
okay, so I'd like to go back a bit to, you mentioned a deductive argument regarding the, that human beings can ask the right questions, correct? Now, the reason why we can ask the right questions is because there's a certain amount of intuition that we had regarding the questions to ask. Now, that comes under, I connected that to, you could say, mysteries and problems. All right, when we have problems, when there's physical phenomena that we categorize into problems and mysteries, right? We say problems are things that can be approached causally, rationally. We can understand where they come from, what they are, etc. But mysteries are essentially phenomena that cannot be explained in some, what do you call that? You could say elements of knowledge that cannot be explained. So where do they come from? I would to a certain degree connect that to intuition. We always ask ourselves, where does man get his intuition from? Now, of course, if you look at more, it's difficult to say modern psychology, but if you study Freud or if you study Jung, etc., if you study them, you realize that there is a certain realm beneath what we can consciously comprehend, which we are completely unconscious of. All right, it's called essentially the unconscious, but it's something that we have no idea about. We get to know it through different, you could say, different ways like sleep or through active imagination, etc. Now this realm, it doesn't have to be a realm that exists outside space and time or outside our minds. It can be memory that has been accumulated throughout, you could say, our years of evolution. Of course, this is going by evolutionary theory, etc. Right? So you have to understand one thing. You and me sitting here, we aren't. With respect to individual names, as you and me and individual, etc. And units, you could say, of human beings, we are however old we are in age. But with respect to, but evolutionarily speaking, and with respect to hardware, we're actually, you could say, 1 billion years old, right? And all of that memory is essentially stored. Now, we don't actually have access to all of them. We don't even know. We know abstractly we have a certain idea that it's there, but actually storing it, actually accessing it, all right, we don't have direct access to it. It comes to us when it comes to us, when we need it the most, right? We can call it instinct, etc. Etc. So something like that can exist, even in that helps us even in the higher, what do you call, cognitive activities like thinking, etc. Something like that. So I think that's where our intuition comes from. And now that is basically data, right? That is basically data that has been accumulated over those billions of years, right? And so that's where my what do you call my initial. I still think it's all an empirical process in the sense we have data. We have data that has been accumulated over this time, and essentially all our rules is from that data. Are you could say created from that data. Even our basic intuitions, like Kant said, Kant's idea was that not everything is what you call absolutely empirically you could say taken in. There's something before that empirical, you could say, sensing that happens. He called it intuition. He basically put space and time in that category of intuition. Before we sense anything, we have to intuit space and time. All right, we don't sense space and time, we intuit it. And so, but even that intuition of space and time doesn't have to be something that doesn't have to come from a realm other than memory. It can come from a memory that we don't have direct access to, that we can't, consciously access. We can, or maybe consciously access after a lot of, you could say, practice, etc. But yeah, and so that was my what do you call argument. And you mentioned Husserl as well. I haven't read Husserl, but some of his phenomenology deals with basically trying to understand what exists behind the observer, in the sense what exists behind the initial, you could say, observation of something, like the sensing or the experiencing of phenomena. What exists behind that? So I'm not going to go too much into that because even I haven't really read him. I've read one of his disciples, Heidegger, again. Heidegger. I don't want to bring up Heidegger here. Now, coming back to data. Why is data important? Now, from a machine learning perspective, it's quite simple. From a data science machine learning perspective, it's simple because, well, it's not the data itself, but it's you could say it's the quality, or you could say the sample of data. Like I mentioned earlier, all right, in any what do you call when you're training a model, you're never going to take all of the data related to that because there's too much. There's essentially, if you split up, basically time can be split up. We understand that, right? So there's essentially an infinite amount of data you can actually create based on the splitting up of time, etc. So if you take all, and you can't really take all of this data for except computational purposes, for like I said, bandwidth, etc., structural bandwidth.
Right.
So what it comes to is sampling. Now, why sampling is important is simple, because you want the sample to represent the whole, right? If it doesn't represent the whole, then any model that you build on a sample, well, isn't going to work on all of the data. So from that point of view, the data itself, yes, is very important. And of course, with respect to studying the data and actually understanding what models to build on it, etc., that is very, again, dependent, what do you call, on the data. And yeah. You mentioned something else regarding interpretability of a model. Like you mentioned, let's say a model, basically a model that learns has certain parameters that it learns you through, right? And you mentioned interpretability. Let's say you go into a neural network and and you look at the weights of the what do you call different neurons and connections in the neural network, etc.
Yeah.
So this is again model set. So there's models that have high interpretability, that are easily interpretable, and models that aren't very easy. Example, linear regression are very easily interpretable because why? Because they're just constant coefficients of x and y, etc. X, Y, Z.
Right.
So they're very easily interpretable, right? So this again is dependent on the model. But yes, there are a lot of models that are difficult to interpret simply because of the what do you call essentially the language that the model itself uses to basically make those connections and basically the algorithm, I should say, not the model. Yeah. So when you differentiate, you should differentiate between the algorithm and the model, because the algorithm is what you use to create the model. So the model is so the language that the algorithm uses, language, when I say language, I'm talking about the parameters, the equations involved, the maths involved, all of that is sometimes difficult to directly interpret, all right, by a person. So now, that's about it. With respect to data, again, the simple fact that you have to, the data has to be a good sample, or should I say, a good representative of its whole. That's what it comes down to. You get what
Yeah, right. So yeah, what I'm most interested in is, you're right, the sample. I mean, that's such an important question. What I'm most interested in is what are the motivations that make us decide beforehand, the criteria for a good sample, to judge that what would constitute a good sample and a bad one. Because it's very interesting. You look back at, I mean, we are not the first generation to gather a ton of data. In fact, the heroes of this process would have to be people like, I'd say, Tycho Brahe and Kepler, right? And if you look, and it's an interesting question, what motivates man to seek out, to make exactly those particular measurements as Tycho Brahe made, right? It's, he chose to measure the position of these planets at different points of time. Not only that, there's also the question of what leads a man to identify, a particular planet at another point of time, though it's appearing at different place in the night sky, with what he or she saw earlier. What motivates them, and this speaks to something. It's highly plausible, like you say, that that would constitute a mystery, right? It's plausible that we will never create a model for human thoughts that explains what induces man to make the measurements that Tycho Brahe did. And of course, what I'm interested in is what Kepler did after that, right? Actually, Einstein was most interested in Einstein had a lifelong correspondence with his friend Maurice Solovin, and in that he talks about Kepler a bunch of times. I'm not going to repeat it because I've spoken about it before here, but basically, after we answer the question, if we could ever answer the question of why Tycho Brahe was induced to make the measurements he did, we would have to still answer the question of why Kepler was induced to try to model those measurements as he did. Because Kepler, remember, first tried to fit the paths of planets onto circles. That was the logical thing for him, and actually that's what Copernicus thought of. And we can understand Copernicus' motivations roughly, in the sense that some planets seem to end up at the same place after a certain period of time. So Copernicus just roughly said, oh, well, they must be describing circles around the sun, if you imagine the sun is stationary. And when that failed, when Kepler was not able to fit them onto circles, he immediately went on to ellipses, and there he succeeded, right? Einstein was deeply fascinated with this because he said, why would we choose ellipses? An ellipse is purely an object purely of interest to man, to mathematicians. And yet Kepler had a deep faith, as do other scientists, that this object that was purely of interest to human beings should have some reflection in the natural world, in the external phenomena. It's a very peculiar thing, and this is what Husserl was talking about. It's curious that such a thing. It's basically that the modeling of the planet's motion fell into the realm of problems rather than mysteries. At least at that level, Kepler was not 100% accurate, and his accuracies had to be patched together hundreds of years later with general relativity inaccuracies. But at least at the level of abstraction he was dealing with, somehow the Galilean style of assuming it would come under the realm of problems actually worked. And that's interesting. That's very interesting and fascinating. We have to pause now because... Oh, no, sorry.
Sure.